To the confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill of Pete Hegseth to become the next Secretary of Defense. Among the Democrats asking questions, first-term Senator Elissa Slotkin of Michigan, who pressed the former Fox News host and military veteran on whether he would carry out an illegal order if President Trump were to issue one.
What I think I'm most concerned with is that no president has the right to use the uniformed military in a way that violates the U.S. Constitution and further taints the military as that apolitical institution that we all want, right? And our founders designed the system so that, we had posse comitatus, that we weren't going to use active duty military inside the United States and make American citizens potentially scared of their own military. We went through our own experience with that with the British. As the Secretary of Defense, you will be the one man standing in the breach should President Trump give an illegal order, right? I'm not saying he will, but if he does, you are going to be the guy that he calls to implement this order. Do you agree that there are some orders that can be given by the Commander-in-Chief that would violate the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, thank you for your service. But I reject the premise that President Trump is going to be giving illegal orders.
No, I'm not saying he will. But do you believe there is such a thing as an illegal order that Joe Biden or any other president, Donald Trump, could give? Is there anything that a commander-in-chief could ask you to do with the uniformed military that would be in violation of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, anybody of any party could give an order that is against the Constitution or against the law.
Right. Okay. So are you saying that you would stand in the breach and push back if you were given an illegal order?
I start by saying I reject the premise that President Trump will be giving
you've done your
any illegal
to him,
orders
but
at all.
This isn't a hypothetical, okay? Your predecessor in a Trump administration, Secretary Esper, was asked and did use uniformed military to clear unarmed protesters. He was given the order to potentially shoot at them. Helos flew low in Washington, D.C. as crowd control. He later apologized publicly for those actions. Was he right or wrong to apologize?
Senator, I was there on the ground.
I understand, and I respect that.
I've been there.
But you're about to be the Secretary of Defense
that was involved in that moment. I
was he right to? So he was
legality and the Constitution.
Sir, was he right or wrong to apologize?
I'm not going to put words in the mouth of Secretary Esper or anybody else.
He said them himself. You don't have to. What are you scared of? Did he do the right thing by apologizing?
I'm not scared of anything, Senator.
Then say yes or no. You can say no.
The laws and the Constitution.
No answer. Senator Slotkin joins us now. She serves on the Armed Services and Veterans Affairs Committees. Also with us, NBC News Senior Executive Editor for National Security, David Rohde. Good morning to you both. Senator, obviously a frustrating line of questioning there. You never got an answer. I think a lot of your colleagues on the Democratic side would say the same in their lines of questioning, never getting a firm answer or anything satisfying. Based on what you heard yesterday in that hearing, how will you vote?
Well, look, it's not that hearing gave me more confidence in his ability to be the Secretary of Defense. I mean, I've worked for 4 secretaries of defense, Democrat and Republican, very proudly. I've gone up for Senate confirmation to be an Assistant Secretary of Defense. I've seen secretaries make life and death decisions in the dark of night that actually impact deeply the security of Americans. So that hearing did not give me more confidence. He did something a little bit unusual. He did not meet with any of the Senate Democrats, with the exception of the ranking member, before the hearing, but instead scheduled meetings with us after the hearing. I was supposed to have one today. He postponed it. I'm still willing to meet with him. So I'm going to withhold final judgment until I have that private conversation. Maybe he can say something, particularly on the constitutional issues. But if he wasn't willing to say them in public, I don't have a ton of confidence that he feels them as strongly as I'd like him to feel them.
What did you make, Senator, of the performance, the lines of questioning, the defense of Pete Hegseth by your Republican colleagues all down the line? Do you believe there's anyone on the Republican side in the United States Senate, on the Republican side of things, that will vote against this nomination?
Well, the senators on the Republican side will be typically the first ones to talk to you about the importance of national defense and national security, and I'm right there with them on the importance of it. But it was therefore hard to watch, as many of them literally just gave them softballs. I mean, pitched them. and in some cases just made the case for him. And I think that regardless of like sort of whether you're going to vote for him or not, at least exercise the role of the committee, which is oversight, right? As our founders intended, just oversee, push and prod on behalf of the 3 million people in the Department of Defense. So it was a little disappointing to see people who I know have asked tough questions of others, including other Republican secretaries of defense, then kind of just like give him a softball and watch him hit it out of the park.
Senator Slotkin, good morning. It wasn't just that he had no answer there to that line of questioning, but also in the hearing yesterday, he gave no answer at all to whether or not he would uphold the Geneva Conventions. Of course, such a foundational agreement, one to protect U.S. soldiers abroad. What is your make of that? How troubling do you find that revelation?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to follow up a little bit at the end of my questioning about the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Is he going to interfere with that? You know, he has been known to defend strenuously soldiers who were convicted of war crimes, whose own fellow soldiers in their own fellow unit, in his own unit, turned him in and said, this is what he just did. He just shot at innocent Afghans. Mr. Hegseth is known very widely as defending him and getting President Trump to pardon them. And so I want to know, you know, what standards is he going to be upholding? Is he going to uphold the Uniform Code? Is he going to interfere in the Uniform Code? He actually didn't give me a lot of comfort on that. He said, well, it's my job to be involved in that. Well, if you're going to go mucking around with individual soldiers and the system of justice that has governed this institution for its entire founding, it's very concerning because he's got to be the guy who's holding up these values for our institution.
Senator, were you given access, were you able to read the FBI report on Pete Hegseth?
I was not. The ranking member and the chairman were the only ones, as I understand it, on the committee who were given access to it. And, you know, again, this is just sort of one of those due diligence, like, let's just be transparent. You want to run one of the most important institutions in the world, just make that report available. And so, you know, I didn't. I don't know that it has. I've heard it's kind of thin. But I think, again, if I were him, I would want to be full transparency given some of the negative stuff that's out there.
Were you under the impression that you would automatically receive the ability to read the whole report yourself as a United States Senator sitting in the committee?
Yeah. Again, I think what we all have to remember is in the era of President Trump, you know, there are norms and there are laws. And President Trump and his nominees do not tend to follow norms. Of course, the norm is that an FBI report on any candidate, on anyone up for confirmation, Democrat or Republican, that information would be made available. Think of Supreme Court justices, think of other cabinet level officials. But it's a norm, not a law. And I think it's a harbinger of what's to come, right? We should all be aware that as of Monday, a lot of the norms that have kind of governed Democrats and Republicans, again, are going to be upended. And so I would have liked to have seen it. I still hope to see it. But I'm not shocked that they're breaking some of these norms.
So, Senator, was there anything you heard from Pete Hegseth in this hearing that showed he had the experience, the temperament, and the knowledge to lead the Pentagon? What was the best thing you heard and the most concerning?
Well, I do want to say, you know, I understand that we've had certain standards for prior secretaries of defense. But I think what you heard in that room on the Republican side, and I come from a state that Trump won, right? I just won on the ballot in November, and so did Donald Trump. People are looking for a disruptor, right? People are saying, well, you know, he doesn't have the typical experience. That's not a negative to a lot of Americans right now. So I think that for me, I think what I'm concerned about is that under Trump, the last time, General Mattis was his first Secretary of Defense. I had served in and around him for a long time. I trusted that if the president had asked him to do something that would taint forever the view of Americans, of their military, that General Mattis would have said no. Secretary Esper, we didn't always agree on things, but when push came to shove and Lafayette Square happened and there was outrage by retired military across the board, he apologized and he said, I'm not going to use, for instance, the 82nd Airborne active duty troops. He stood up. And I think what I'm concerned about is that as we go into a second administration, he's not looking for people who are standing up for the institutions.
Yeah. Senator, I want to ask you about transparency, and maybe you can explain this to us, how it worked, who may have blocked information from getting to the American people so they could have a more educated judgment on this nominee. But time and again, and it really was highlighted by Tim Kaine, he would talk about some of the most disturbing incidences in Pete Hegseth's background. And Pete Hegseth would call them anonymous smears. And then Senator Kaine would follow up and say, well, actually, they're not. These are whistleblower reports, and we have names attached to these whistleblower reports.
Yeah.
Mark Kelly said the same thing. Mark Kelly brought up a really good line and basically said, if you've had this road to Damascus experience, where you've had this great conversion, that's inconsistent with you saying it never happened before, that it was anonymous smear. So it's trying to have it both ways. But I am curious, why is it that the American people were not able to see those whistleblower reports that would have attached names to these deeply disturbing incidences for a lot of Americans? And instead, he could just say something that was obviously a lie when he said they're anonymous smears. Because, again, as Senator Kaine and others said, they weren't anonymous smears. There were names attached. Republicans just didn't want Americans to see those whistleblower reports. Can those reports come out? How could the Republicans have stopped them from coming out?
Yeah, again, this is norms versus laws. And I think what you have here is just, my Republican colleagues are now in the majority as of, last week, and they are setting the rules for these committee hearings. I mean, we're hoping to keep the standard of just having the certain senior members of the committee see these FBI reports. And I think, again, we're just going to have to press and try to make the case and appeal to people and their conscience about some of these nominees. But I also will say, it's not crazy for some of these folks to be very concerned about retribution. Not the Republican senators. I'm talking about the whistleblowers, the former family members of Mr. Hegseth. I think we've heard rumors that there's a lot of concern about coming and being public, putting your name out there, coming and testifying, coming and talking to people because of a fear of retribution. And so I just, again, this is norms versus laws. We all know that on Monday, the President Trump, what we hear is potentially 100 executive orders in at least the first couple of weeks. So we hang on to our hats here. Things are going to come fast and furious. And there are substantive issues to look at, separate even from just process.
You did your best to get to some of the truth yesterday in that hearing. Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin of Michigan. Senator, we always appreciate you being with us. Thank you.